We're going to pick back in our study tonight in the book of Nehemiah as we continue this three-book study in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. As we kind of look through the book of Ezra, we were looking at basically the return to Jerusalem, the beginning of the rebuilding of the temple. In Nehemiah, we pick up with his concern about reconstructing the walls, and we're kind of in the midst of that story. I want to first say just thank you to Austin and Matt who filled in for me while I was gone. We're going to kind of pick up in chapter 5 tonight and look through 5, 6, and 7 as we continue our study in this book. We're really at the beginning of this. We're kind of right in the midst of this section where Nehemiah and those who are building the wall are facing opposition. In chapter 4, we are looking really at threats that were besetting the laborers who were all external in their source. We can think about Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem and the Ammonite and the Ashdodites. All these people who were either ridiculing or all trying to disrupt the work of the Lord. In chapter 5, we go to more internal threats. And those threats are really posed by their own kind, their own people, the rulers and the nobles, who are then taking advantage of the situation and then creating conflict that prohibits the wall being built. And then move back into chapter 6, and we have kind of a mixed group of oppressors. We have some from the external or outside, but those outside influences have made alliances with the priestly families and others in the land, and they were all working together to cause fright, and cause the work to stop. Now, I don't think the parallel is intentional. But I think it is a consistent picture of whenever people are engaged in the work of God, they're going to face opposition. The fact of the matter is when you read the first 8 chapters of the book of Acts, this is exactly what we see. When people are setting out to the kingdom of God is being built through the preaching of the gospel, we see external threats, don't we? And we see internal threats. We think about Ananias and Sapphira and Saul and all the priests and all the other people that beset the church. Now, like I said, I don't think this is foreshadowing that. But I think it's just a consistent response from people who oppose the work of the Lord. That when people are engaged in good and doing the Lord's will, there will be people who oppose us. And if we get nothing else from Nehemiah in these 3 chapters, we ought to just be reminded that when we're engaged in the work of God, when we're building, you would think that everybody would jump on board and say, this is a good thing, this is what we ought to be doing, but there will be people who oppose us. And there will be people who try to put stumbling blocks in our way. And there will be people who try to ridicule us, to divert our attention from the work. It happened in Nehemiah's day. It happened when the church began. It is always going to happen. And the best response to that type of opposition is found here in the book of Nehemiah. And his response is twofold. One, pray to God, and then keep working. That is the best way to overcome or to face the opposition that we're going to be faced with in this life. That's exactly what Nehemiah does throughout this text. So, with that being said, I want to jump to chapter 5. And I know Matt covered a little of this in our last class, but I want to kind of get a running start into chapter 6 and 7. And as chapter 5 begins to open, we have really the people making an outcry. It says in verse 1 of chapter 5 that now there was a great outcry of the people and their wives. The idea is there was just this great lamentation, this great voice of protest. It's kind of the same word that's found back in Exodus chapter 3 when the people were enslaved in Egypt and they made an outcry and God heard their plea. Nehemiah hears the voice of the people that are leading. And so the question I have for you first, what are they objecting to? What are they crying out against? What's the problem that they're facing? Okay. No bank examiners. Okay. Exactly. So that's part of it. So it's kind of a multifaceted issue, right? So in verse 3, it mentions the word famine. Okay? Now I want you to note that, because the question is this a famine as a result of just kind of inclement weather? Like, it was dry and the crops didn't produce? I don't think so. It seems like so many people had left their villages and towns to come work on the walls. Look back in chapter 4, in verse 22. Nehemiah said at that time, I said to the people, let each man with his servants spend the night within Jerusalem, so that they may be a guard for us by night and a laborer for day. It seems like people left their homes and came to work on the walls. And if they had left their homes to come work on the walls, what's happening? They're not tending the crops. But that's not, as Victor mentioned, that's not the only level of this problem. Their own countrymen then took advantage of the situation in what we would call predatory lending. They saw a chance to make profit over the ill fortune of their brethren. So we kind of read that, so they're without food. And so what we see the people beginning to do in verse 3, verse 2, first of all, that some of the larger families who seemed to be involved in the building, they were just without food. Others had to mortgage their fields to buy grain or to pay the king's taxes. And even others seemed to have to create indentured servitude within their families. Now, again, keep this in the context of they're doing the work of the Lord, they're sacrificing to do the work of the Lord, and other brethren, the rulers and nobles, are taking advantage of that situation. So, how does Nehemiah respond to that? He go, oh well. How does he respond? He gets angry, doesn't he? That's what seems to point to the text. It says down in verse 6, then I was very angry when I heard their outcry in these words. I'm struck by Nehemiah. He has a sense of righteous indignation because the people of God are being taken advantage of by others. I'll tell you, since the fall in Genesis chapter 3, one of the worst crimes it seems like is perpetrated amongst humanity is the fact of how much humans take advantage of one another. And here we have the very people of God that started off in chapter 3 in this kind of cooperative effort to engage in the work. As soon as an opportunity arose that they could take advantage of someone else for their own benefit, they were willing to take it. And Nehemiah was angry. And it says he consulted with himself. He didn't fly off the handle. He didn't act excessively. He didn't act out of whimsy, but he was angry at the situation because wrong was being perpetrated. And he stopped and thought what to do. Now, what does he call what the brethren are doing to them? What's the word used in the text? What is it there? He says, if you'll look down after he consulted with himself, and look in verse 7, I consulted with myself and contended with the nobles and rulers and said to them, you are exacting usury, each from his brother. What is that? We've kind of alluded to it, but what is that? Huh? Yeah. They're charging interest or maybe even excessive interest to the harm of others. So the question is, what's wrong with that, though? Shouldn't, if I loan you money, shouldn't I be able to get a reasonable return for that? What's wrong with that for them? The law prohibits it. So a couple of different places. I think there's a number of issues in this text that Nehemiah points out. And the very first one, as Boyd mentions, the law prohibits it. So turn with me, if you will. Let's look just quickly where it violates God's law, and we'll turn there. The Exodus chapter 22. Exodus chapter 22 and verse 25. simply says there, he says, if you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. Look, if you will, in Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy chapter 23, and look at verses 19 through 20. It says there, you shall not charge interest to your countrymen, interest on money, food, or anything that may be loaned at interest. You may charge interest to a foreigner, but to your own countrymen you shall not charge interest, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land which you are about to enter and possess. So first of all, Nehemiah's anger is stirred because what they're doing is a direct violation of God's law. But I think there's a couple of other ideas mentioned in this text. Look how what's worded in verse 5, of Nehemiah 5. When the people cry out to Nehemiah, here's how they introduce part of their lament. Now our flesh is like the flesh of our brothers, and our children like their children. What's their lament? Their lament is these are our brethren. We're part of this covenant family, and you're taking advantage of it. There's kind of various degrees if you talk about if I took advantage of anyone, it would be wrong. But it'd be especially worse if I took advantage of one of my brethren here who's in a financial straits. We're the same flesh. We've got the same goals. We got the same purpose. And yet they disregard that for a chance at profit. So they violate God's law. They have no regard for the covenant family. As I mentioned before, this idea of this predatory lending, we kind of see that in our culture, don't we? Victor probably knows more about all that than I do, but I'm just going to, every area that's impoverished or has some socioeconomic disability, what do you see? Checks for cash, cash for checks, thousands of them. How much interest do they charge on that? And we justify it in the terms of, well, they're a bad risk. Well, they might be, but more often than not, we're trying to take advantage of the situation. When you go see car lots in those areas, the interest rates are through the roof, and some of the lending practices are just prohibited. And that's the very opposite of what the kind of people that God wants, especially among his people. Psalm 15 is one of those great psalms that asks the question, who may dwell on God's holy hill? I want to look at just Psalm 15 and verse 5 for just a minute. And just notice some of the characteristics. Verse 5 specifically. Psalm 15 and verse 5. He who does not put out his money at interest, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent, he who does these things will never be shaken. So even in this short psalm of 5 verses about who's going to be able to dwell in the presence of the Lord, one of the qualities that he points out is really the idea of not taking advantage of someone when they're in dire straits, especially those of the household of faith. And then I want us to notice verse 8 of Nehemiah 5. Here's Nehemiah's response to the part of his response. He says, I said to them, we acting according to our ability have redeemed our Jewish brethren who were sold to the nations. Now would you even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us? Do you understand what he's saying? He's saying that their actions at that time in some ways is acting in contradiction to what they did earlier. It seems, according to verse 8, that they had made a concerted effort while they were in exile in Babylon and Persia, that some of their brethren had gotten sold off into slavery, and then the Jews sought to buy them back. They pooled their money and bought them back from indentured servitude. And he says, you know what you're doing? You're undoing all the good that we strove to do. And so he got angry. But that's not all he kind of points to in this text. Look down in verse 9. He says, again I said, the thing which you're doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of God? Let's stop there. There's a second one in verse 9. But their actions not only was a violation of God's law and took advantage of their brethren and also seemed to act contradictory to the previous behavior. It's really indicative of a fact they didn't fear God. I mean, we have things like that in our midst, right? I mean, things that we kind of measure, but really it may be an indication of a heart issue. The external action was they were charging interest and take advantage, but really the heart issue, these nobles, they weren't fearing the Lord. They weren't giving him respect and honor. They were doing these things willfully. And finally it says in verse 9, because the reproach of the nations are enemies. Our enemies are looking at us and seeing how we're treating one another, and we are making the people of God a reproach. Now, I say all that to say, is there any wonder that Nehemiah is not angry? I mean, anger is one of those things that we're kind of uncomfortable talking about as Christians, right? We think we kind of ought to be above that. I mean, never get angry. But the fact of the matter, Nehemiah and Jesus himself shows us when wrong is all around us and the people of God are taking advantage of one another, there is a place for anger. It should hurt our souls to see this kind of thing. And it did Nehemiah. And so he responded. And that's what we have really in the last part of this section, beginning in verse 10. He says, we're going to pick up the reading in verse 10. And likewise I, my brothers, and my servants are lending them money and grain. Please let us leave off this usury. Please give back to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their houses. Also the 100th part of the money and of the grain, the new wine and the oil that you're exacting from them. And then they said, we will give it back, and will require nothing from them. We will do exactly as you say. So I called the priest, and I took an oath from them that they would do according to this promise. I also shook out the front of my garment and said, thus may God shake out every man from his house and from his possession who does not fulfill this promise. Even thus may he be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said, Amen. And they praised the Lord. And then the people did according to this promise. So he called them on it. And thankfully, they seemed to repent and made a solemn vow before God that they would return and not require anything of the people. Now, the rest of chapter 5 is taking up with the example of Nehemiah. And his example is wonderful. But what connection? I think it's an interesting connection that he has with what's been going on before. And the reason I say that is because Nehemiah is leading from the front. It's hard to call these guys to account if you were doing something similar or not doing anything at all. But Nehemiah is not only providing an example by his own behavior, he's saying, look, this is how you should be acting. And when he speaks to them and upbraids them, he has the moral high ground, so to speak. Remember the statement Jesus makes about judging your brother and the log and the speck? Well, Nehemiah's actions show that he considered the speck in his own eye, or the log in his own eye, before he looked at the speck in his brother's. And so look at what Nehemiah does here. Back in verse 10, he says, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them grain. Verse 14, for 12 years, neither I nor my kinsmen have eaten the governor's food allowance. So I've foregone that. He says in verse 15, I wasn't like the previous governors. Why? Because I had a fear for the Lord. Verse 16, I applied myself to the work on the wall. I mean, he got his hands dirty is what he's saying. I mean, how many government officials do you often see doing that, working beside the people? That's what I applied myself to the work in the wall. He said in verse 16, I didn't buy any land, and all my servants I dedicated to building the wall. And then finally, in 17, he sets a table for 150 Jews and officials as well as additional foreigners. Why? Notice at the end of verse 18, because the servitude was heavy on this people. And the question is as you look at that list, did Nehemiah as governor, as Nehemiah's leader, did he have a right to take up the food allowance from the king? Yeah. Did he have a right not to work with his hands? Yeah, he had a lot of other stuff on his plate, but he foregone all of that. He gave up his liberty, his rights, out of service to the people. I mean, we have a passage like that in the New Testament, don't we? In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, don't we? The Apostle Paul talks about himself as apostle. Doesn't he have all these rights? And I keep trying to say that word. He gave them up for the sake of the Corinthian brethren. I think you have an example here of Nehemiah, kind of a servant leadership. So, thoughts, Larry?
Yeah, Nehemiah set a great example. And can't take away from that. But we wonder, did the cupbearer pay that kind of money that he could accumulate that much that he could take care of all these people? Was that a high-paying job being the cupbearer?
I don't know. Well, I mean, so Larry's question was the cupbearer a high-paying job, but by this time he was also governor as well. So the governor itself. Yeah, so.
He didn't do it. He had his own money.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, it's not in there.
I don't know.
Forget it. It's just wasted.
No, but that's a good thought. I don't know where it came from, where he got his money that he could set this type of table. But he obviously had it somewhere, and he was spending it on behalf of them. Good question. No. Good point. Anybody else on chapter 5? Victor.
I think it's interesting, verse 7, how he didn't just address everybody, the whole congregation, but he went directly to the source of the problem. Even though the source of the problem was the leaders, people who were influential, people who could possibly get in trouble. He said, look, this is wrong, and we're going to address the issue, we're going to start with the issue. And it looks like, and I may be reading into this, but maybe the first time it didn't work when he went to them, and I'm reading into this a little bit, but it says, I contended with them, and therefore I held a great assembly against them, and then in verse 9 says, then again I said.
Yeah.
So it's almost like he went to them, and then he brought them before the group, and then they're like, oh yeah, this is good.
Yeah, I mean, it's very possible that he had an ongoing struggle with them. Victor suggests, there's a couple of points in Victor's. First of all, he went to the source of the problem. He addressed these people who may come back to him, but that didn't deter Nehemiah from doing what's right, and he was persistent in dealing with it, whether it was one long conversation over multiple attempts. Good point. Anybody else on chapter 5? Well, let's move to chapter 6. And we're going to now see that things have progressed. And it's at a critical point, and it's almost to the point that Nehemiah and the people who are working on the wall have succeeded in their goal. Fact is, in verse 1 of chapter 6, it said all the breaches of the walls had been closed, and no breach remained in it. He had just not set up the doors and the gates. So it was getting close to completion. So you can imagine the enemies of God's people, Sanballat, Tobias, Geshem, and all the others, they were kind of getting frantic about what the objective they were trying to reach. So as we begin in chapter 6, we have this letter of invitation from Sanballat and Geshem. And the letter invites Nehemiah up to a village on the plains of Ono, which is about 7 miles southeast of Joppa. It's kind of between the border of Samaria and Judah. So apparently there were Jews living in that part of the country, but it's kind of no man's land. It's kind of a place of kind of demilitarized zones. So they invited him up there. And it seems like maybe the pretext is they're going to make peace or try to be conciliatory. But in verse 2, he says they were planning to harm me. Nehemiah seemed to understand the underlying reasons based upon past performance. I mean, they had been out to get him from the very onset. He knew who was the source of all his troubles, and he wasn't going to succumb to it. But what I find interesting in this text, at least one of the things I find interesting in this text, is even though he turned them down, he says in verse 3, "So I sent messengers to them saying, I'm doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you?" So he rebuffs it. But what I find interesting is, do they give up? So the very next verse says they sent, if you look in verse 4, they sent to me 4 times in this manner, and I answered in the same way. 4 times in this manner. So I just guess there's a point that I would make there, that kind of evil doesn't take a day off, and then also the idea of this persistent trying to weaken the will of Nehemiah. I mean, they just kept trying the same tactic 4 different times, at least here at the onset of chapter 6. They kept trying to get him into this, and Nehemiah kept rebuffing them. But they weren't satisfied with that. The second attempt they took, Sanballat, it says in verse 5, they sent an open letter. Now, what was the contents of the open letter? What was the charge? What were they alleging? Yeah. He says, you're rebuilding these walls for the sole purpose of rebellion. The fact of the matter is people are in the, what's it say? There's people, prophets appointed to proclaim in Jerusalem, a king is in Judah, and it's going to be reported to the king. Now, I want you to understand how subtle and insidious a threat this is, because it works on so many different levels. So first of all, he makes these charges. And I tell you, you're going to be worried about those charges. You remember back in Ezra chapter 4, the enemies of God's people did the exact same thing, and what did the Persian king do? He shut the work down. So there is a basis, a historical precedent of this type of ploy working. So here they're threatening this, and at the very least, Nehemiah's got to be concerned about it, and he's taking his eyes off the prize. But on top of that, he's got to take the time to squash out these rumors. He's got to stop this. And he sees through their behavior. And in verse 9, he says, all they were trying to frighten us, thinking that we will become discouraged with the work, and it will not be done. He says all of their efforts have been designed to frighten us. Basically, he said that all of their efforts are basically a type of psychological warfare. 4 different times in this text, this word frightened is found in verse 13, verse 14, and verse 19. And so he says all of their efforts are seeking to frighten us and to get us to stop. And what's he do then at the very end of that? Pray. Yeah. But now, O God, strengthen my hands. Some of your translation says he prayed to God, but I think it's inferred by just the text itself. But strengthen my hands. Do not let me to be diverted from the work, from the purpose that I'm engaged in. And so that didn't work. So what do they do next? They have this one who we have in verse 10, Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was shut in at home, says, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple, for they're coming to kill you, and they're come to kill you at night. Now, I want you to understand that a couple of things here in this verse. You say, well, how does he know that? Well, look, if you will, in verse 12. He seems that seems to be, he claimed that to be a prophecy, it seems like. Then I pursued that God surely had not sent him, but he uttered his prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had heard him. So this one that he's meeting with seems to be saying that I have a word from God and you need to go flee to the temple because they're going to come kill you. He calls it a prophecy. Now, the question is why does Nehemiah not go? What reason does he give down in verse 11? He gives two reasons that he doesn't go flee to the temple. In verse 11. That's right. Yeah, 2 Chronicles 26, right? What happens when someone who's not a priest goes into the temple of God? Uzziah, leprosy. Okay, well, that's one reason. What's the other one in verse 11? I think it's implied in this idea, should a man like me flee? What do you think it would do to the people if they saw their leader flee from a threat? I think he's concerned about if they saw him flee, that it would adversely affect their confidence in God and the work and him. But then secondly, as Harold mentioned, that's kind of the other part of verse 11. And could one such as I go into the temple, and literally the text says, and live. Some of your translations will say to save his life, but literally it's and live. Can I go into the temple and live? And the answer is no, because that's a place for the priest. And so he sees this individual as being hired by Tobiah and Sanballat. And he said, they're just trying to frighten me again. And again, Nehemiah would not be diverted. And so in verses 15 and 16, we see the work completed. In 52 days, the work is completed. So basically, from chapter 2 to chapter 6, we're covering basically less than a 2-month period of time. 52 days is what the text says. Some people want to dispute that, but I don't see reason in the text. And I want you to understand how astounding a feat that is. You remember Matt last week put some charts on the wall? Most people believe the walls around Jerusalem are about 2.5 miles long. So with an average height of roughly 36 feet and about 8 feet wide. And so in less than 2 months, they accomplished that task. How long did it take us to build this addition? Took longer than 52 days. And I mean, granted, we've got some different systems involved and maybe a little more complication than laying stone. But just first of all, just marvel at how that was accomplished. How everybody bought into the work. But notice ultimately who they said in end of verse 16, this work had been accomplished with the help of God. God accomplished this through the people. But what's even more amazing about that 52 days is everything that has been transpiring in chapters 4, 5, and 6. Because chapters 4, 5, and 6 talk about the opposition. And the opposition seems to be fierce. And what the opposition hoped to happen was to cause people to be frightened and stop working. But you know what happened? God shows his triumph was even greater because he overcome all their stumbling blocks they put in front of the people. It made his victory even greater. I mean, so much so, what's it say? It says in verse 16, when all of our enemies heard of it and all the nations around us saw it, they lost their confidence or fell very much in their own eyes. For they recognized this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. And I'll tell you, that is a pattern too in the Old Testament. How God not only triumphs, but triumphs over amazing odds to show his greatness. When the people came out of the land and they triumphed over Sihon and Og, they said, how did the people of God did that? They're not an army. Well, God did it to inspire fear. Look at Psalm 126 for a second. Psalm 126. In verse 2. It says, when the Lord brought back the captive ones of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouths was filled with laughter and our tongue with joyful shouting. Then they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad. That last phrase, the Lord has done great things for them. When the times are the bleakest and darkest and the challenges seem insurmountable, that's when God's greatness shines even greater. And so in some ways, in chapters 4, 5, and 6, all of Sanballat's and Tobiah and Geshem's efforts were not only futile, it actually showed forth the grandeur of God even more. So much so, the countenance of the nations fell. That's amazing. That's the amazing God we serve. He not only triumphs, he triumphs overwhelmingly. But the chapter's not done. The chapter points to one other thing. It says, throughout all these days, Tobiah and Sanballat and Geshem were not just attacking externally. They had also arranged alliances within some of the priestly families and others. If you look down in verse 18, it says that Tobiah, many in Judah were bound by oath to him. They were bound by oath. Some by marriage. You have a son-in-law in Shechaniah, the son of Ezra, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam. And then we jump over to chapter 13 and verse 4. We see he's also worked into the high priest family, Eliashib. So he had created these contracts, these political, through marriage and other dealings. And what these people would do, they would come to Nehemiah and tell him how great Tobiah was and how well-intentioned he was. And all the time they were spying on Nehemiah and his efforts and giving information to the enemy. So he faced all of these threats, but because of the hand of God, they triumphed. So, thoughts through chapter 6. Got just a little bit of time. Okay. Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is another one of those chapters that has a list of names, and it is really easy, and it's not exciting reading, but it does have kind of a purpose in the flow of the letter, I believe. So first of all, I want us to just simply note that chapter 7 seems to be a transition point. The first 6 chapters are really about Nehemiah rebuilding the wall. The rest of Nehemiah is about Ezra rebuilding the people of God and their attitude toward the law and God. So chapter 7 is a transition. So you kind of get this big list of names and you go, whoops, okay, there's a division here. So first of all, that's what's going to take place. But there's some important information, I believe, in chapter 7. And let's start and just quickly read the first 3 verses. It says, now when the wall was rebuilt, and I had set up the doors, and the gatekeepers, and the singers, and the Levites were appointed, then I put Hanani, my brother, and Hananiah, the commander of the fortress, in charge of Jerusalem, for he was a faithful man and feared God more than many. Then I said to them, do not let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot. And while they are standing guard, let them shut and bolt the doors, and also appoint guards from the inhabitants of Jerusalem, each at his post, each in front of his house. So what we see here in these first 3 verses is after the walls are completed, Nehemiah wants to secure the city, right? And he goes about doing that by first delegating authority to these 2 individuals, Hanani and Hananiah. Now, Hanani, we find back in chapter 1, that appears to be some relative of Nehemiah. But then he also mentions Hanani. Now, let me ask you this. If you're going to pick a guard for a palace wall, what kind of characteristics would you look for? Okay? You're going to guard this city. You're going to fight off any threats. What are you going to look for? Okay?
People that live in cities.
Huh?
People that would live in cities.
Okay, well, part of it, people are going to live in the city. And why is that? Because they got a vested interest, right? Now, typically, we think about guards like, I might put Charles on the wall because he's tall and he can shoot and he's got eagle eye vision. You know, that's the kind of people I'm going to stick on the wall. But look at the two characteristics that he specifically mentions about Hanani and Hananiah. They're faithful and what? They fear God. The two most important qualities for Nehemiah is, first of all, their integrity, their faithfulness, because that is a measure of a good steward, 1 Corinthians chapter 4. But their trust in God. Because they knew, like Harold said, they had a vested interest in protecting the city of God and the people of God, and that would make up for any other deficiencies they might have. The second thing I just want to quickly notice is he took the gatekeepers, after he set up the doors, he took the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites. The gatekeepers were typically people who guarded the entrance to the temple, but it seemed like Nehemiah used those also to help guard the gates to the city. It seems to be the implication there. And I think that the point is not only was the temple the dwelling place of God, the entire city of Jerusalem was meant to be a place of worship for people to enter in and to offer worship to God. Now, the rest of the list it talks about, he finds in his heart, and basically the list at the rest of the chapter is a repetition, or whatever the word. It's the exact same thing you find in Ezra 2. So it's almost the exact same list. And so the question is, why does he repeat it? A couple of things. First of all, it seems like one of the things about this that we don't kind of get or highlight is even though the city was rebuilt, people didn't live in the city. And we kind of get that in verse 4, don't we? Now the city was large and spacious, but the people in it were few and the houses were not built. So this list became part of Nehemiah's plan in chapter 11 to move people back into the city. So that's part of it. The other part, I guess, I think is important to note in this. I think in some ways this list shows us the faithfulness of God. He was true to it. He made that promise in Ezra 2 at the start of their journey, and as he repeats it again in Nehemiah 7. So we have God's faithfulness over a period of time. Some things about the list that might tell us a little bit, or things that we could look at. As you kind of go down through this list, it lists family names, it lists all of these different groups. It tells us each individual is important. But it also tells us that Nehemiah was very much concerned about who they were from. Because right in the midst of this, if you look down in verse 64 and 65, there were some who they could not be priests because they were not part of the ancestral registration. So this list became important about who was going to get to serve God in what way, and if they could serve in the temple. And then it shows us that every gift was important. He goes down and lists all the gifts. But I think even more than that, this kind of shows us the connection between the building of the wall and what maybe the ultimate purpose was. Sometimes, why did they build the walls, right? Well, for the glory of God, protect the city. But ultimately, it was about the people, right? That's what this list shows us. The walls were built to protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And the walls were built in such a way that the people would learn to work together again, that the people would learn how to cooperate with one another again, how people ought to be about the task and the business of God. So in some ways, it's kind of a fitting in. It's a reminder of what this whole building project was about. I think sometimes we do that, right? We start doing a task for a certain purpose, but then we get involved in the task itself and all the details and the minutia and the work, and we forget why we're doing it. Chapter 7 reminds them, why did we build the walls? The people of God in God's name being lifted up. That's chapter 7. Thanks everybody for your attention. We'll pick up. I'll send out the questions next week and we'll continue on with Nehemiah. Thanks.